how this chat works. First, I want to explain that this is our first time using Longitude, so bear with us as we experiment with this technology. And the way the format is going to work is that Michael and Chris are going to chat with one another for about 40 minutes. I'm going to start it off with a question for each of them, and we'll take turns answering, and then the competition hopefully will flow from there. And then at about the 40-minute mark, we're going to start fielding questions. So you can submit a question at any point. If you look on the right side of your screen, there is a questions tab. And in there is a field that you can type in your question. We won't get a chance to answer everyone's questions, of course, but we'll take ones as they come in. So submit them as they come to you. We've also gotten some questions submitted to us in advance. So at about a 40-minute mark, we'll be fielding those questions, and the chat today will last for about an hour. So with that, I just want to take just a second to introduce our two panelists. Both Chris Martenson and Michael Shuman are fellows of Post-Carbon Institute. Chris is the creator of the Crash Course, which is a 20-chapter online video course that educates people about the intersection of the economy, energy, and the environment and population. Since it launched in 2008, it's been viewed millions of times. I don't even know how many millions, but along the millions. And the DVD has sold over 20,000. This is also the author of a book, and we'll see if I can pull it up here, by the same title called The Crash Course. Let's see if this shows up. Oh, can't really see it. It's behind the videos. But that book came out, what was it, in 2010? Is that right, Chris?
2011.
2011, okay. And so Chris is, an expert in talking about what all these changes that are happening in the economy and with energy are, how they're going to be impacting individuals, and he'll talk about that a little bit today. Our other panelist is Michael Shuman. Michael is an expert on building local economies. He is his hat in a lot of different things. He's the Director of Research for Cutting Edge Capital, Director of Research and Economic Development at the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, fellow, as we mentioned before, Post-Carbon Institute. He holds an MBA with Associate in Economics and International Relations from Stanford University. And he's the author of a number of books, but the latest is a book called Local Dollars, Local Cents, which is the first of a four-part series that Post-Carbon Institute is publishing with Chelsea Green on community resilience. And that book's focused on how we can shift our money from Wall Street to Main Street. So with that, thank you both for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I know you're both very busy. And I wanted to start off with you, Chris, and then with you, Michael, to talk about, Chris, maybe you could talk first a little bit about why it's so important for individuals to be thinking about shifting their investment strategies, and talk a little bit of the ways that they can go about doing it.
Sure. Yeah, to begin with why, everything that I was sort of very concerned about back in 2005, 6, 7, when I was developing the ideas in the Crash Course, have really started to play out. Unfortunately, I think that the short answer to that question is all you have to do is open a newspaper, turn on the TV, look at what the central banks are doing, look at budget deficits to understand that we're suffering through a very, let's say, intense crisis, both on the fiscal side, the monetary side. There are these huge, giant trends afoot, economically speaking. And that ultimately, though, I think to really understand what's driving this time, all you have to do is pull up and put a gas nozzle into your gas tank and then see what happens to the little numbers that whiz by as you're doing that on the pump. Because really what we're in the middle of is a fairly profound energy crisis right now, liquid fuels crisis, petroleum crisis. We're out of the cheap and easy stuff. And the short answer to this question about why we have such urgency right now is that our economy, our entire way of life is structured around this idea of endless growth. And we grow by having petroleum there to move 95% of everything from point A to point B. And we're sort of at that level where we've got pretty good confirmation at this stage that we can't keep growing in that same way. We're going to try and do something right here that's never been tried before with about $10 trillion of fresh central bank money creation. We're going to attempt to recover. With oil over $100 a barrel, the world's never done that before. Maybe we will this time, but maybe not. And that's always been my message: is there are risks here, and And the individual, I think, in this story needs to understand what the implications are of this idea that maybe recovery won't happen, that maybe instead of central banks being able to buy enough time for our debt loads to sort of sort themselves out and continue to grow, what happens if that doesn't turn out to be the case? What happens if we, more importantly, are at a place where we can no longer reliably count on growth to have our traditional investments behave like we hope and expect them to? So stocks growing up 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe even 10% on a real basis over the long haul, depending on how you measure. Bonds being essentially worth what we price them at, because in the future we'll get both the principal and the interest component back. Those are the sorts of giant trends that I see in play right now, that there are legitimate questions that everybody can and should be asking of themselves. And these are at the individual level, but I also think pension funds, endowments, anybody who's got money in the market should be asking this question: how would I price it if growth is no longer a reliable feature of this market? And I think the answer to that is, well, obviously we'd have to discount the market a little bit. But more importantly, what are the structural or even worse systemic risks that might lurk if we've constructed an entire system around this notion of growth and it can't grow anymore? Do we understand what this would look like? Do we really know where the risks are, what they are? And, in my mind, when I see what's going on in the ECB, for instance, doing everything it possibly can to prevent a default, I don't think they really care as much about Greece per se as they do about the entire economic system. There's actual legitimate fear and concern, much the same as Hank Paulson brought with him when he first went for the $750 billion of bailout funds back in '08. There's this concern that if one piece of the system fails, maybe the whole thing will. And we don't know if that's true or not. And I'm not saying I do. I'm just saying that there's that concern. And so I think that the prudent individual, much as somebody who owns a structure which has a legitimate concern of fire, would carry fire insurance, that the private individual should think about, how do I insulate myself? How do I make my own investments more resilient? And my program, such as it is the same one I use for myself personally, which is first, understand that the market itself is risky, and for me that meant pulling some of my money out of the market. And this meant for me pulling back into cash positions, pulling into gold and silver. Did that a while ago. And that's just sort of as a core position to say, listen, no matter what, I'm pretty sure these elements will be okay. And the second is to invest in yourself, invest in your physical infrastructure, in your own home, that there are, if you believe in this concept of peak oil, that energy will become more and more expensive over time, that this bottoming out of the percentage of disposable income that went towards food and fuel in 1998, that was bound to reverse, and reverse it has. I think that reversal process is going to continue. So anything you can do to insulate yourself from rising food and fuel prices is a wise investment at this point. And there are absolute, forget about we're worried about sufficiency or availability of fuel. We can just get a spreadsheet down, and for most people, air sealing your house has a really tasty ROI right now that beats anything you can get from the market on a guaranteed basis. So does insulation, so does solar thermal for hot water. There's a variety of investments that can be made that have really compelling, very nice returns on investment, all on their own economically, but when you think about the resilience they bring to you as well, then, of course, there's even more benefit to them. And then as a final component, if you've got a little money out of the system, you've invested in yourself, you still have money left over, I really think people should be working with financial advisors who understand the risks, understand how to maybe navigate the landscape with an eye towards really having investments be as safe as possible. And unfortunately, anybody who's opened the newspaper and saw what happened with MF Global, maybe had some concerns about the system. There's been a lot of rule changing going on. It's a very uncertain landscape for investing in this stage. And in fact, with the central banks doing what they're doing, I think we have to admit that investing is maybe not the right word anymore. It's more like speculating. If the central banks chuck another 2 or 3 trillion into the markets this year, I think they'll do reasonably well. But if they don't, they'll probably do poorly. What are they going to do? I don't know. Nobody does. So it's really a form of speculating. And I think that in that speculating environment, it's all too easy to take losses. And it's therefore, we're back to paraphrase that old saw. I think this is a period where people should be most concerned about return of capital rather than return on capital when it comes from money that's out in the marketplaces. So really those 3 things, just get some money out of the system, invest in yourself, and then be very careful with where your money happens to be invested going forward.
Thanks, Chris.
So I think what I would add to that, I have some thoughts about investing in yourself. That's actually the last chapter of Local Dollars, Local Cents is titled that, and certainly I came to, after 250 pages of analyzing a bunch of local investment opportunities, kind of came ultimately to the conclusion that investing in yourself really is the most important starting place. But what I would like to comment on now is really 3 points that sort of reinforce what Chris has said. One is my agreement that the market is very volatile, very risky, much less likely to pay the kind of secure return that we have grown up thinking it will. The second point I want to make is that local investments as real-world profitable opportunities actually look pretty good. And then third is to talk about some of the conceptual reasons why local investments ought to be given a very careful consideration. So on the first point about the market being volatile, I begin Local Dollars, Local Cents by talking about the date of May the 6th, 2010. And that was a day when in about 10 minutes, the market lost almost 10%, and some stocks went close to zero. Now, people spent weeks, months trying to sort out with all of that, but I think it was a clear reminder that all of us have placed inordinate amounts of money into a Rube Goldberg system that we can barely understand and is subject to enormous risks, some of which Chris has mentioned. What I would add to that is, when you take a look at historic rates of return of the market, we're often told that you're going to get, if you're a long-term investor, 8, 10, 12, 20%, if you listen to the Rick Edelmans of the world. And what we're not told is that all of those numbers are in current dollars, not real dollars, so they don't include inflation. And all of those numbers compound gains each year, so it's very hard to compare investments in yourself or investments in local businesses that might pay an annual dividend. And when you do look at the annual returns in real terms from the market, it's really more at about 2 to 3.5%, depending on how you count it. And I think at that level, people can kind of sober up and look at other alternatives more seriously. And frankly, I think that there are so many people in this country right now who are looking at local investment that it will not be long before there is a significant exit from Wall Street. And when there is that exit, of course, the market is going to have even less demand, and the prices will get worse, and I think this could be a self-reinforcing cycle. So keeping one's money in the market, business as usual, is exceedingly risky. Second point I would make is that the local businesses that are in most of our communities really are much more significant and competitive economic players than we've often thought they were. Just a couple of quick data points. Local small businesses are about half of most of our economies by output and by jobs. These businesses are spread across sectors. Really, if you look at 1,100 sectors of the North American Industrial Classification System, NACE, really small businesses dominate nearly all of them. And it does show that we have lots of models for competitive small business. And what another interesting thing is, over the last 20 years, the relative share of the economy occupied by these businesses has not changed very much. Actually, the biggest change has been a growth in home-based businesses, which kind of underscores that over time, these businesses, despite the neglect, in my view, of economic developers who favor attraction or retention of non-local businesses, these businesses have actually done pretty well. And if we take the oil and rising energy prices that Chris mentioned, and I think all of us are acutely aware of now when we fill up our gas tanks, local production for local consumption is going to become a lot more competitive. We can say that without any doubt. And so even things like manufacturing, which, we've just sort of ceded to China, I think much of that manufacturing, particularly of non-durable goods that weigh a lot and don't have a lot of value, like wood or bricks or food, these are things that are all going to come back to the regional or to the local level if we're prepared to rebuild our economies around that. Last point I want to make is that local businesses actually are really interesting ways to invest your money. I give lots of examples in my book of businesses that over 15, 20 years have local businesses that have paid 5% per year on the money that people have put in them. Now, I'm not saying that every local investment is going to be great. You're going to have to be a discriminating investor locally as one needs to be nationally. But that said, here are three undeniable advantages of local businesses. One is you can actually visit them. You can meet the entrepreneur. You can feel the goods or experience the services. You can talk with the employees. Your chance of getting taken in by an Enron-style fraud are much lower. Second point is that when you invest locally, there are many bottom lines that you experience. So one is the business does well and it circulates money, but actually local businesses disproportionately spend money locally, so they tend to be terrific drivers of economic development. And the last point is that because local businesses often spend their money with other local businesses, if you create a portfolio carefully chosen around these businesses that are connected to one another, you actually have a way of building your wealth, getting a kind of synergy in your portfolio that conventional portfolio theory, I think, does not give enough weight to. So let me stop there, and we can continue the conversation on these points.
And Michael, I love the idea that what you're describing is something my grandfather would recognize very well. This is not a well-known fact. I come from a long line of bankers. For somebody who criticizes the banking industry as much as I do, it's kind of a hidden fact. My grandfather was president of the bank, his father, and my grandfather, the quintessential local investor, small regional bank, upstate New York, he knew every single customer, every single prospect. He didn't just know the customer, he knew the customer's family. So loans were actually very intimate affairs. And interesting fact here, his father tried to talk him out of going into banking once upon a time because it was a high-risk, low-return sort of a thing to be involved in back in the 40s. To obviously, that structure has been completely inverted. But I think what we're talking about here is the idea that the days of taking your money and sending it off where it heads off into the ether and hopefully gets a real return of 2 or 3% and then comes back to you when you need it, that we're talking about taking a piece of that now and putting it into stuff you can touch, you can feel, you can see, you can understand. That's the big part for me, actually understand where the value is being created, where the wealth is being stored, and hopefully getting all these other bottom line effects in your community, like actually resilience and skills-based accumulation, and also having real jobs that are purposeful and fulfilling for people to do. That most of that actually comes from local businesses, has been my experience so far. So I guess I'm saying I think we're going back to the future. We're going to go to a world my grandfather would recognize again after a little departure of some kind.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's interesting that the data from everything from the Fed to Consumer Union, every year they look at the relative competitiveness of larger banks versus smaller banks, and smaller banks have lower default rates. And I think the reason they have lower default rates is exactly what you're explaining with your grandfather, which is the relationship base of evaluating risk, of evaluating who you want to put your money into, is still a much more successful tool than the abstract, we're going to calculate your credit risk, and on the basis of that, we're going to determine what kind of money you're going to get. So I think all of our grandfathers were really onto something there. And what I also see is it's not only back to the future, but it's acknowledging that these local businesses that I think we have not given enough weight to. I think most people assume that the locally owned businesses in their community, the small businesses, are kind of the backwater, maybe 10%, 15%, but everything is sort of chain stores. And the problem is people look at their economy with sort of retail glasses. And it is true that global retail, the Walmarts, the Targets, etc., have really given a shellacking to local retailers. But retail is only 7% of the economy. And in the other 93% of the economy, local businesses have actually really done very well. I mean, not in every single sector, but in a lot of them. So I think acknowledging, respecting, and then growing this, what is often 50% or more of our economy is not such a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I love hearing that. My view of resilience is actually a fractal model, and so if I say I want to live in a resilient world, I believe we have to have a resilient country or set of countries that interlock and create that resilient world. And I don't know how the country is resilient unless the individual states are, and I don't know how a state is resilient unless its communities are, and I don't know how a community is resilient unless the individual communities are resilient. That's how I start in many cases with investing in yourself. First, it's an easy way to get started. Sometimes those investments have low barriers to activation, and they're not expensive. And that anything that can move us towards action today is a really good thing, because I have this sense of urgency. 2008 shot across the bow, and that would have been a great time to say, wow, look at this crisis, what should we do? And somehow we avoided the key lessons on that. Derivatives are 100 trillion higher than when we started then. Indebtedness is actually higher. It's just been transferred over to the sovereign side rather than off the private side. And so I'm convinced that the sun comes up every day. We have a lot of resources still, but the clock is ticking in some way. That's the sense I have personally. So I motivate individuals to take action just because I think getting started requires a first step of some kind. What are you seeing out there in the communities? Is there a sense that something really is fundamentally shifted, that we have to start thinking differently? Is there urgency that wasn't there a few years ago?
Well, I think, so one thing that I can notice, when I started talking about local economies, and probably you had a little bit of this sense too, given that, you were sort of talking about coming crises when the world was not paying attention to it. I started talking about local economies in 1998, and the first place that I gave a talk to, University of Kentucky, 2 people showed up at, and 1 left early. And I really felt like, even when you can rivet a few people's attention, it was more the Battle of Seattle activist crowd. And then, starting in the 1990s, the crowds grew, and it became much more local business oriented, and the business people understood that they had a stake in making this work, and the risks were getting greater. And I think since 2008, what I've noticed also is a shift from a kind of buy local thinking to a invest local, and I think it does reflect an underlying terror about the financial system. I think people really are afraid that the system can blow up again. And, let me just say one other thing about resilience, is because I think, we're both in these fields where portfolio theory guides a lot of investment thinking. And so much of investment thinking, when you listen to these retirement gurus, they say, well, you want to diversify in stocks and bonds, and they'll kind of run through a list of things. And when you think about it, actually, they are all interconnected in the global economy. And there's no resilience in that whatsoever. And what we really need to do is create truly diversified kinds of elements of our portfolio. So I think what you're talking about, commodities, gold and silver, a little bit of that global economy, maybe you're going to keep a little risk in there, but most of it is in many parts of yourself. And I love when you talk about in your own crash course about people getting out of debt. I think that is the highest priority. And investing in their house, that's probably their second highest priority. And then thinking about all the ways you can improve your own property to improve your resilience, whether it is energy efficiency, putting on a solar hot water heater, or putting in a greenhouse to become more food self-reliant.
Oh, absolutely. These things are all things that I think have really nice economic returns baked into them. But for me, the real benefit was, and I admit, I started down this path a while ago because I had concerns. So let's say that was fear-based. Knowing what I know now about how my life is structured, like if I could turn this camera around and point it out the window, you'd see my big garden and my orchard that I put in, and the quality of life that I've obtained from making these actions, as well as the cost savings. Those two things together would now draw me towards this, and that's what I'm seeing as my personal shift is these big moments of crisis, they can become existential, right, where we get to ask some of the big questions, like, wait a minute, what are we doing? If our national narrative says it's all about shopping and consumer growth, there are enough people now waking up going, maybe there's more to life than that, potentially, and what would that look like? And for me, it's been a story of finding out that many of these same investments that I want to make, whether it's spending more time in my community or investing locally or investing in myself, that I derive a lot of benefit that goes way beyond just the economics of this. And again, I feel like I'm discovering something my grandfather already knew. And that, in fact, that I grew up in a very unusual period of time, that rather than something that I think is just the new reality and it's how the future must look like, however I grew up, I'm wondering now if I didn't grow up during a very odd moment of departure in human history where we forgot some things and we gained some things. And so the big existential questions right now are really large. They're like, well, what should I start doing that's new? What should I stop doing that doesn't make sense anymore? And what things should I continue doing? And those are the sorts of things that I find are really up for grabs when I talk to audiences. They're really fairly fundamental questions that are coming up right now. And so going back to the basics, I think makes just all the sense in the world right now. Particularly, there's that old saw, if you're at a card game in Texas and you don't know who the sucker is at the table, it's you. Right? A lot of people have that sense about their investments right now. They're like, I don't know who the patsy is in this game. I put my money out there on Wall Street, and somehow they get record bonuses every year, and my stuff is going nowhere. What's going on? And so I think that I agree, and I hope that you're correct with the idea that the pendulum is going to swing. That the days of sending 100% of our capital out into the faceless universe to do things will then reverse, and we'll bring that back where we can invest in the things that are tangible. We understand the value proposition. We know what wealth is. We're redefining that into double, triple bottom line kinds of things. That is the sort of new trajectory that's out there, and I think it's wonderful. Actually, I think it's a really good thing.
And I think part of it is to redefine what we think of as investment. I think that for too long people have said, well, there's my lifestyle over here and there's my investment life over here, and really it's all part of a whole. One of the exercises that I do, and this is just talking about really narrow concept of rate of return, and I agree that there's lots of other considerations here for going the community resilience route. But, without getting too much into the math, one exercise I do in the book is I say, okay, suppose we are really generous, really optimistic about Wall Street and say it's going to deliver 5% rate of return. And if we're adding in the benefit from tax deferral, we'll make that 7% rate of return. What would it take from an asset, an additional asset in your house that added no value to your house when you sold it, so it's kind of a wasting asset? So let's consider it over 10 years. What would it take from that asset to equal the 7% from Wall Street? Well, if you work it out, it's about 16%. So just doing the exercise, could you invest $1,000 in energy efficiency and bring down your energy expenditure $160 a year? To me, that's a no-brainer. There's 100 ways people know how to do it. Could you put $1,000 in a greenhouse and reduce your food expenditures $160 a year? No problem. If you put $1,000 in a nice bicycle and avoid $160 of gasoline, that's easy. Or $1,000 even in an espresso machine and avoid one Starbucks coffee a week, you could save the 16%. So I think getting people to revisit every element of their lifestyle and say, where is the money leaking out to other people unnecessarily?
Absolutely. You know, I had a really nice podcast recently with Charles Eisenstein, and he had a great way to frame this. He said, you know, a lot of the most recent trend has been we find ourselves paying for things that we didn't used to have to pay for, right? So, you know, bottled water being one example. Water used to be free, but there's lots of things, including entertainment. And his challenge was, he said, if you really want to build community, one thing you can do very simply is to just find something that we currently pay money for that we didn't used to. So maybe that's entertainment, you know, break the guitars out and everybody gathers again, or childcare. There is some way for people to get together and start to reel back in those things that we've abdicated out and decided cost money. And there's lots of things that don't cost money anymore that we can do very simply. So I think I left one thing out, you know, and I'm glad you brought up the get out of debt, because I do advise people to get out of debt. I kind of forgot that one. And there's one other thing in there as well, which is that anything that we are currently sort of frivolously spending money on, this is a really good time to take a careful look at the budgets and pare them back, because it's startling how many ways in my own life I've discovered that the money just sort of dribbles away. There's a million ways to spend money now that we didn't used to have available to us. So often just taking a good hard look at those can have some very nice returns as well. I know it's kind of like conservation. It's not really sexy, but it's the old school way of going about it. And it's another conserving money and resources at this point is something else I advise.
It's insourcing our life. You know, it's bringing back all these pieces that we've given away, thinking that, you know, we'll be much more productive as workers in the one narrow thing that is our global competitive advantage. And I think we have to get out of that mindset and really appreciate that it's actually having these multiple things that you do around the house and do in your community is what brings value and joy into your life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we're in violent agreement on that. Can we find something to disagree about?
Let's see. What would we disagree about? Well, we might disagree a little bit on whether energy prices are going to skyrocket or just go up modestly.
Okay.
So I think I'm more upbeat than you are about the potential of massive implementation of energy efficiency. But then again, who knows? I mean, it is all a crapshoot. But I look at, say, the Europeans or the Japanese and see, you know, what kind of economic growth they're able to wring out of a much more efficient use of energy. And if we could bring that level of efficiency into this country, boy, we'd buy ourselves at least more time and more money to try to dig ourselves out of what's around the corner.
Oh, you know, this is a thing that where my work is currently taking me is trying to understand why it is that we're not doing the things that just make imminent sense. So solar thermal, for instance, we know the sun's really good at heating up stuff. That's its primary best use, more than photovoltaics by a long shot. And there are countries which actually mandate that when you put a building up, you're going to put a solar hot water heater on the roof because it makes sense. So I don't care if you care about carbon going into the atmosphere, or national security in terms of how much energy we have to import or how long it's going to last, or even social justice, wanting people to be able to afford their energy bills more realistically. On all of these dimensions, putting solar thermal panels on rooftops makes sense, right? So if we had a narrative that said whether we care about stewarding our remaining energy resources, whether they're going to last one more year or 1,000 years, we just care about not using them when we don't have to. I can't figure out why we would continue to burn hydrocarbons, whether that's coal that goes to electricity, that goes to your electric hot water heater, your gas hot water heater, your oil furnace. I don't understand why we're burning hydrocarbons at this stage to heat water when we have this very exciting technology developed in the 70s. It's very simple, that we could use very, very easily and rather elegantly. You could have domestic job creation because we have to ramp up the manufacturing around that. There's the installers, the people to maintain that. There's all kinds of things that come from this. The only thing that's missing seems to be the narrative that says this is something that's important to us. So if you look at the 2013 federal budget, the Department of Energy is 8% of that total pie. And in that, 0.01% of the total pie is dedicated to things like solar and wind. It's not a priority. It is not yet important to my country to become like Germany or most of Europe or Japan, where you mentioned, I agree, there's so much we can do with efficiency. The question is, how do we get started?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I am. I guess my point of despair is partially what the federal budget is not doing, but it's also that the country now has two totally different narratives about the future. And if you listen to the Republican debate, and I don't cast aspersions on Republicans generally, because I view myself as sort of politically moderate, but I think that their debate over, gee, we can just burn more hydrocarbons, we can just do more fracking, we can just burn more coal, and there's no weighting of the real cost of doing this, that these sources are getting harder to find and more expensive, and this illusion of plenitude and cheap energy just is not true. The second thing is that the environmental costs are enormous, and the third is just a total misunderstanding about the way that subsidies proliferate through our energy system. And I'm one of those people who've wanted to wipe out all corporate welfare for everything from solar to wind to nuclear to oil and gas, because I just think it's so massively distorting of our marketplace. But I feel like in this national narrative, there's a belief that all of these hydrocarbons are highly competitive, and if we just put more put more subsidies into there, they will just blossom and save the day.
Well, the subsidies are incredibly hidden. I think it was the Cato Institute and one other, maybe it was Brookings, I forget, that looked at what would gas cost if we actually layered in all of the military expenditures, Carter Doctrine, you have that huge footprint in the Middle East, and plus all the past expenditures and the debts we carry thereon. And guess what? Our gas is $8 or $9 a gallon too. What we chose to do in the United States is subsidize it so it would be hidden from public view until such time as we had to reckon with those debts that accumulated. Europe, same warning shot across the bow in the early 70s, said, looks like there's an energy predicament, maybe we should get in front of that, put very high taxes on, and then of course it enforced all those other behaviors through normal market forces, smaller cars, more efficient appliances, generally speaking, everything more efficient. So here we are in this country. My sense of concern is around the idea that market forces left to their own devices, Vaclav Smil shows this beautifully, energy transitions take 4 or 5 decades all on their own, right? It just takes time for the embedded capital to rot away. You don't switch to the steamer until your sailboat is gone, right? Sailing vessel. So if we wait for normal market forces to start taking advantage of even the natural gas that we've got, think what we will of the fracking and other costs associated with that. If we wait for normal market forces, I would predict it'll take 4 or 5 decades. I don't think we have that kind of time here. I just don't.
Yeah.
Let me jump in here, guys. This is a really very interesting conversation, and there are lots of threads that you guys started opening up here that I think we could explore further. One point you just raised, I think, gets this question of the market and the role of government and market, and part of this is people taking control into their own hands, right? So one question we have from somebody here is just maybe, Michael, you could talk briefly about the barriers to local investing, right? So obviously, I think you guys are both in agreement that starting with investing yourself is the place to go for lots of different reasons. But when it comes to actually thinking about shifting our investments, what are the barriers to those? And maybe just talk really briefly about how that landscape might be changing.
Right. Well, I would say that until recently being last week, the biggest barrier was law. And that is that we had a system of securities laws in place in this country enacted during the Great Depression that made it exceedingly expensive and difficult for the 99% of us who are unaccredited, that is not wealthy, to put money into the 99% of firms that are small and local. And last week, Congress, in my view, did a good thing, not a perfect thing, but a good thing in making crowdfunding, that is, many people putting small amounts of money into business, relatively legal and cheap. And I say it's not a perfect thing because I think if people get tempted by long-distance crowdfunding penny stock opportunities, they will continue to be betting on losers and high-risk enterprises. But if one thinks about crowdfunding as opening up the best of your community-based businesses to your investment, then I think it's going to be a home run. Now, it's not enough to just create things that you can put your money in. I think the other barriers are that we lack liquidity in these markets, and so we're going to have to start seeing the creation of local stock markets, and there are companies like Mission Markets in New York which are beginning to pioneer some virtual ways of doing that. And then we have to create various kinds of diversified investment funds that unaccredited investors can participate in, and the law really restricts that right now, and that's probably going to be in the next horizon of trying to reform some of the laws.
Gosh, if I was going to point to a barrier, I would point to the idea that traditional investing, stocks and bonds, is marketed to us constantly, 24/7. So there's an entrenched mindset there which says that's what investing is. I routinely have, here's a small example, I routinely have conversations with people where I have to get into the act of convincing them that cash is a legitimate investment position to be in. Because you have to have your money fully invested or it's not working for you. You know, there are plenty of times when taking your chips off the table and going and getting a drink makes a lot of sense. You know, one of the best investments in Japan from '89 through to about 2000, one of the best investments was cash. It was an excellent investment if you look at it that way. So I think one of the barriers is breaking down this idea that investing looks like this, and it's just stocks and bonds, and we have to be aware that is marketed to us so aggressively, and that they've got really a very, very large budget, and they use it very well.
And what do you guys think about expectations? I mean, Michael, you talked a little bit about the fact that people have this preconceived notion that the market, you know, has given people a return, 5 to 7% or whatever it is, and when you actually look at it, it's much less than that. Do you both think that we have to actually shift our expectations in terms of return on investment?
Yeah, I think we should. I think, I end Local Dollars, Local Cents by talking about my dad, who retired seemingly like a wealthy man, but he actually lived a very middle-class life. Squirreled away a modest amount of money for a pension, but never depended on Wall Street. And I think that all of us need to figure out a long-term lifestyle that does not depend on unusual payoffs from far-flung investments. And I think part of it, to go back to some of what Chris said, I think part of it may be to start rethinking how we put together our communities. It may be that rather than, warehousing our parents or grandparents, we actually create home-based care and understand that taking care of people over the generations is part of what it means to have a great community.
I agree with that one wholeheartedly, because it's a hypothesis of mine that it may well be that there are only two generations that are allowed or get to enjoy what we think of as an entitled retirement, sort of a lifestyle. That may be an artifact of a debt-based or an exponential money system having all the sufficient energy it needs to create this thing which, allows people to retire at age 50 in some cases in some municipalities. And if that turns out to have been an artifact of our times, and certainly there's lots of pressures, and we're seeing that agreement sort of break down, right? Canada just notched up its retirement age by 2 years, and we're seeing those sorts of pressures everywhere. Municipalities are coming to grips with the idea that the promises they made around retirement aren't sufficient. So here was this idea that we could live relatively anonymous lives, put our money out into Wall Street, somehow we'd have enough left over for a relatively anonymous retirement. If that story breaks down, what do? Well, I think what we do is we go back to saying that how we retire and how we care for our elderly is part of this integrated sense of community that we have, just like it always used to be. It's something that's not anonymous, it's not faceless, it's not also maybe something that we can really count on as we counted on in the past. This is just it's a possibility. Extraordinary change is happening around this one field alone, just because of demographics, but I think also because of energy on the other side of this story. And those are the things that I'm hoping that, we need real adult-sized conversations around that. That's not happening at the national level. Michael, we were talking narrative before, on both parties. What I see being talked about in the presidential cycle is don't even really make it to the top of my personal concern list. My concern list is populated on entirely different things at this point. Although there's nominal talk about debts and deficits, but not even really at this scale, I think, is necessary. So in many cases, I see that what we need to do as individuals and as communities is really be in front of this conversation. What kind of another barrier do I see in this? There are a lot of people I know that are waiting for the solutions to come from the top down. They're waiting for Wall Street or Washington to sort of wise up and figure these things out. And I think more and more people are waking up to the idea that could be a long, if not forever, kind of a wait.
I want to get to another barrier, which is, you talked, Chris, a little bit about the fact that we're being constantly marketed to in terms of, investing in Wall Street. But there's also a whole industry that's there set up to advise people on how to do this, right? So there are mutual funds and there's brokerage houses and all these things. So if somebody put aside these barriers, the regulations, security regulations barriers to keep people from investing locally, just even take a credit investor who can invest, wherever he or she wants. How do they go about, without having, a whole industry to advise them in terms of local investments? How do they go about actually thinking of, making good and wise decisions about what businesses to invest in?
It's never been easy to figure out what to do with your money. It's a fairly complicated environment to be in. There's, somebody who's a broker today has to know about, I think, around 20,000 separate different products, be they individual shares of stocks or mutual funds or ETFs or you name it. And so then you have that whole world to sort of navigate, and then the question is, how do we evaluate and look at these other opportunities that come in locally? And there again, I think we're going to have to turn to people who've analyzed this, who have the case studies. I know Michael's got lots of those to look at, and I've found that the best way to really start conveying some of these stories is through the stories themselves. And I've heard some really extraordinary ones where people are doing things that just make sense, and the returns are incredible. And somehow, it's up to us to promulgate those stories, because for whatever reason, they don't really get picked up and disseminated very widely. I mean, my marketing budget is kind of low, and I don't know what Michael's is, but compared to Wall Street, it's not a lot. And somehow I don't know what else to do besides make these stories more widely known and compelling, because most people, when they finally hear them, they go, oh, that makes perfect sense. Makes all the sense in the world. I mean, it could be as simple as taking a building that's 40 years old, has the existing HVAC system in it. You can put a 40% more efficient system in that and make money doing that compared to the current utility bills, and that it just makes sense. And again, still a bit of a mystery why more of that isn't happening, or hasn't happened, but more of that is happening now, and I love seeing that.
Well, let me just add, two simple propositions, and the first is that if you have debt, then putting any additional dollars into these far-flung 401ks or IRAs rather than getting yourself out of debt makes no sense. And if you do not own where you live, and you may just have, a co-op unit, you may be part of a co-housing unit, you may have a house, but I think trying to get yourself out of that debt as well, partially because of our crazy tax system, also is a kind of no-brainer way to be investing your money. If you're looking for other local businesses to invest in, one of the things I suggest you think about doing is creating a self-directed IRA. If you have the ability to roll over some of your existing IRA or 401k, and then not start small, 1 or 2%, and then work with your neighbors. It could be a great neighborhood project to try to identify terrific local investments. One of the stories that I tell in Local Dollars, Local Cents is in Port Townsend, Washington, a town of 10,000 people. They created something called Lion, Local Investment Opportunities Network, and it's basically a bunch of local business people and small-time investors who have a party once a month to create pre-existing relationships so that they know what's out there in investments, and that's an easy thing for a community to start and flourish from.
There are a couple of questions here actually about self-directed IRAs. So one question here is, are self-directed IRAs the only way that somebody could take advantage of tax deferral investment gains while investing locally, or are there other ways people could do that?
Well, right now, so unfortunately, if you're accredited, you have lots of options. But if you're unaccredited, you almost necessarily have to turn to mutual funds. And there are 7,500 mutual funds in the United States, and not a single one invests in local small business. There are products that are beginning to kind of move in that direction, I've spaced it out for a second, but there's Calvert Fund in Maryland actually has a community note that you can put money into, and they put money into community development financial institutions, which spread around the country will support local businesses. And then there are, stories that I have about small investment clubs or small revolving loan funds around the country that unaccredited investors can participate in. But it's really hard to do that with tax-deferred money unless you have a kind of core, a mothership of a self-directed IRA you're operating out of.
Can you explain accredited versus non-accredited really fast? It's a question that people have.
Yeah, so accredited means that you personally earn $200,000 a year, or as a couple you earn $300,000 a year, or your house is worth, your assets are worth more than $1 million excluding your house. So this is the kind of bifurcation, what I sometimes call investment apartheid. So if you have those things, you can do anything. And if you don't have those things, well, until the crowdfunding reform last week, you couldn't do a lot.
Yeah, this is a question for both of you from someone. What do you guys think is the role of local currencies in all of this?
I happen to think that right now one of our key risks is that we're all living with a monocrop of a currency, right? You have the dollar and that's about it. And if that crop does well, fine, but if there's a drought or a pest of some kind, then we all suffer for it. And my personal view is that local currencies are going to be much more than a cute little add-on that adds a little color to our local community. They're going to become an important part of having a diverse system of money, again, like we used to have. I mean, once upon a time, you would have a choice of saying, am I going to accept the banknotes from this bank, that one, or that one? And then you could look into those banks and understand which one you would prefer to keep your funds with. And right now, we only have the dollar itself in this country primarily. There are relatively nominal, I would say, local currencies that exist at this point, but my view is that we really should have those become much more prominent. Some states are even looking at reintroducing their own currencies at a state level. Again, these are mostly at the, somebody's penned an act, but I don't know how far through committee and in reality those would actually become at this point. But the idea here is that having different currency systems is a very important thing because they all punish some behaviors and enforce other ones. And so to have just one, which is very good at what it does, a debt-based system enforces a lot of activity because when you're in debt, you work hard to get out from under that. It enforces growth as an operating paradigm. It does a lot of things that up to this point have been considered healthy, wealthy, and wise. And at this point, we might want to say it's time to add other things into this mix. So for me, I think that getting and moving towards these local currencies is an absolute necessity. We will get there. If the dollar fails in some catastrophic way, just like we saw in Argentina when their peso failed after the collapse that they suffered in 2000, 2001, lots of provincial currencies popped up and all sorts of different ways of conducting business arose. And that's just normal. I mean, they will come up in a moment of crisis. I'd rather see us implement them before the crisis comes so we have a chance to work with them, figure out which ones we want. There's all sorts of different ones. Local, exchange traded systems, a lead system. We've got, mutual credit things. We've got our banks and things like that, maybe even circulating notes again. All those things are possible. I would love to see us get to that point before they're an absolute necessity, if we could, and then understand that many of these things actually have wonderful benefits that go well beyond just getting a little extra transacting done. Often they're sold that way. It's like, if we had a local currency, we'd get a few more dollars spent locally, and that's not always the prime benefit from these things. It goes well beyond that into a lot of other bottom line activities we talked about.
My view, I love local currencies. I also know that many of them have struggled to find a long-term business model that they can operate on, and Chris is right that when these currencies, if these currencies occur at a state level, or frankly even at the level of a large municipality, you can get an economy of scale, and you could get a kind of public wheel around the whole thing and make all of that work out. I mean, back in the Great Depression, Philadelphia decided to issue its own script, and instead of laying off teachers and public servants, they partially paid their public servants in the script and then partially collected the taxes, local taxes, in the script. I think, though, there's a couple of related concepts that are worth looking at. There's a currency that's called Bernal Bucks in San Francisco. It's not really a currency. It's sort of a local debit card system linked to a local bank. That has a nice business model associated with it. There's also in Portland a local loyalty card system called Supportland, which also has a very attractive business model around it. So we'll crack this nut, and local currencies can and will flourish.
So we're just about out of time. I know we could probably go twice as long here, and there are lots of questions that people have submitted that we just didn't get a chance to answer. And I would suggest
we should do it again sometime.
Yeah, and folks, if you go to Energy Bulletin to the page where this chat is embedded, you can add your question there as well. And maybe if Michael or Chris have time, they can check those questions out there. If there's anything that you feel you want to quickly, that would be great. I just want to give each of you maybe just a minute for closing thoughts before we end this call. So let's start with you, Chris.
Sure. My closing thought is simply just open the newspaper, look at what's going on in the world, and realize that the time to begin your own steps toward resilience is now. The future has already arrived. 5 years ago I was saying, here are some things that are going to start happening. We're in the middle of it. And we're in the middle of a long process. I don't see what's about to transpire as an event. It's not going to happen next Tuesday at 8:30 in the morning. It's possible. But for the most part, we're in the middle of a process of a very long period of adjustment. And in this adjustment, the hardest thing we have to do is give up our old cherished beliefs. Beliefs about how money works, what wealth really is. We're going to have to add to that description a little bit. Understanding what investments are, some really profound basic sort of assumptions and beliefs that may have been handed to us by our parents or marketed to us by Wall Street. Time to give those up. Think about how we want to operate in this world. Where do we want to be? What do we want our communities to look like? And then make our investments, whether that's in our own skills or our physical money that we happen to have right now or our physical infrastructure, whatever those pieces happen to be, even our emotional resilience. These are the critical investments that we need to make right now. And I think right now is a great time to get started.
And I'll just conclude by, one, thanking you, Asher, for putting this together. Thanking you, Chris, for your time. It's great to get your insights in this. And I would just say that right now, when you look at our long-term investments in stocks, bonds, mutual funds, pension funds, and insurance funds, it's $30 trillion. Not a penny of that really is going into local business right now. Local business is half of our economy. If we get our markets to operate efficiently, half of that money, $15 trillion, will be coming to our local businesses. Imagine what your town would look like if $50,000 per person came in new investment to local business. I think there's enormous resilience possibilities, enormous growth possibilities, and we're part of that change as we shift our money.
Great. Thank you both. I really appreciate you both taking the time, and I encourage people to check out chrismartenson.com. And if anyone wants to get more information about local dollars, local cents, you can go to resilience.org and get information on the book there. Michael's also doing a series of workshops around the country to provide people with a lot more nitty-gritty detail about how they can develop these strategies in their own community. So thank you both. I hope you get another chance to do it again. And talk soon. Thanks, guys.